Good afternoon and welcome to all attendees and the presenters for this Churchill Fellowship information session. Our theme for this session is public spaces, and you're going to hear from two Churchill Fellows, Dr. Katherine Butler-Bowden, who's a 2017 Churchill Fellow from New South Wales, and Katherine Webber, who's a 2018 Churchill Fellow from Queensland. My name is Adam Davey. I'm CEO of the Winston Churchill Memorial Trust. We're based in Canberra, Ngunnawal country, and I'm going to begin this information session by giving you an overview of what Churchill Fellowships are all about, how you apply, and some of the things that we're looking for. I'd like to acknowledge Australia's First Nations people, the traditional custodians of this land, and to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and to acknowledge all the lands from which people will be tuning in to this webinar from. I welcome any and all Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander people tuning in today. Just to let you know, we have a strong alumni of Indigenous Churchill Fellows, and in fact we have a Indigenous Churchill Fellows network run information session this afternoon at 5 p.m. as well. And I know they're keen to provide support and advice to any Indigenous applicants as well. A little bit of housekeeping. You'll be able to ask questions via the chat. We'll answer them all at the end, so be patient, please. We'll deal with them all at the end. If you miss the opportunity to ask a question, you can contact the trusts, pretty much at any time. You can call during office hours. You can send us an email via our website. You can attend another session as well. We've got a few more still to come over the next couple of weeks. I'd like to acknowledge the very difficult times that we're living through. 2 years so far with the COVID pandemic, and we've had floods recently as well. Look, it's difficult with geopolitical instability, but I do hope that you're attending this session with a positive mindset and a hopeful outlook. I know we are. We've just had our first Churchill Fellows travel and return to Australia this year for the first time in a couple of years, and that's pretty exciting stuff. And we've got fellows lining up to leave on their fellowships who would have hoped to have been travelling in 2020. So it is an exciting time for us with fellowships back underway. So I'm often asked where the money comes from for Churchill Fellowships, which is a sensible question. A little bit of history is worth understanding, and you can go to our website to find out more about the trust. Of course, there's probably more written about Sir Winston than almost anyone else in the world, so you can do lots of research about Sir Winston. But I would say, when he resigned as British Prime Minister in 1955 at the age of 80, he'd served under 5 reigning monarchs. He'd survived 3 wars. You probably know he'd been a writer, an historian, a journalist, an adventurer, and a painter. And he'd won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1953. So there was naturally a widespread desire to honour Sir Winston Churchill and to capture the essence of his public service, his inspiration, his intellect, and even his humour for generations to come. Now, he wasn't perfect, and as I said, you can read more about Sir Winston on our website. We last year commissioned some essays to, explore Sir Winston Churchill through a contemporary lens. And I would recommend to you to read those essays and to make your own mind up about history. But one thing for sure is that Sir Winston was a man who readily believed that anything was possible if you put your mind to it, and that the greatest figures in history were those who made a contribution to public service and to the fellow countrymen. So when Prime Minister Menzies announced the news of Sir Winston's death to all Australians in 1965, he also announced a public fundraising appeal. And on what we know as Churchill Memorial Sunday, 28th of February 1965, a door-to-door appeal was launched with over 220,000 Australians volunteering, supported by the RSL, to door knock. And the generosity of Australians combined with the generosity of businesses and government contributions meant that around £2.2 million, so probably around $4 million, was raised to establish the Winston Churchill Memorial Trust as a perpetual memorial with Churchill Fellowships to be awarded forever. So I guess you could call us People's Trust. That money is carefully invested, and we use the returns on those investments to pay for typically over 100 Churchill Fellowships every year. So the other thing I'm often asked is, what does a Churchill Fellow look like? What are the attributes? What are you looking for? And you can read the slide there. I think importantly, Churchill Fellows are invariably passionate about a topic, an issue, something that they're involved in, something that they would like to see change and improve for the betterment of Australia. So they're people who want to learn and share their knowledge so that others also may benefit. So that could quite possibly be you. Now, Churchill Fellowships are unique, and they're a prestigious opportunity open to Australians from all walks of life. Importantly, to understand, it's not an academic scholarship. So you don't need to have any educational prerequisites to meet to apply for a Churchill Fellowship. And nor is it a funding grant. So there's a lot of empowerment and freedom with the Churchill Fellowship to go and do your research, your projects, learn whatever you're doing overseas, without acquitting every unspent cent back to the trust. A Churchill Fellowship, it's not just an overseas trip. That's important to remember. It's the start of a lifelong journey and your contribution to make Australia better. And on your return, there are expectations such as writing a report and sharing your findings and continuing your journey to implement what you learned. Now, Churchill Fellowship doesn't need to comprise formal research. I mean, it can, and of course, as you'd expect, we get academic researchers applying for and are often awarded Churchill Fellowships and undertake quite structured research on their travels. But you can also learn new skills, build networks, undertake a course, observe best practice in your chosen fields in a way that works for you. A fellowship is for overseas travel only and must be taken between 4 to 8 weeks and in one continuous journey. We do have some changes I'll talk about shortly, some exceptions to that. We've awarded nearly 4,500 fellowships since the Trust was established in 1965. And Churchill Fellows travel across the globe on the widest range and depth of topics. And they bring back to this country information, networks, projects, products, ideas, and innovations to make this country even stronger. So you do need to be an Australian citizen, or as of this year, a permanent resident of Australia to be eligible for a Churchill Fellowship. And you must be over the age of 18 years by the application closing date. The eligibility to travel overseas is clearly essential. We have been asked about vaccination for COVID. Do we require that? Well, we don't require it, but certainly you'll find if you want to travel overseas, it is a requirement of most countries that I'm aware of. So you do need to be prepared to be able to travel and do what you need to do to comply with the rules and regulations in relation to travel, which can change from time to time, as we've seen. We can provide support for you if you have a disability. You might need the support of a carer, for example, to travel with you. And we now also offer virtual research options for people who are physically unable to travel. That might be due to disability or perhaps caring responsibilities. And for people living in remote parts of Australia, we've also just introduced the option for domestic travel based on feedback we've received over the last few years about the challenges that can be faced by some people travelling within Australia, let alone overseas, and the relative benefits of travelling within Australia and bringing knowledge back to their communities. Now, Churchill Fellowship, it's an individual award, and you conduct your project as an individual, not as a team. So if you're sitting there thinking, my team wants to apply for a Churchill Fellowship, you've come to the wrong place. But you can apply for a Churchill Fellowship yourself. There can only be one, so do keep that in mind. It's not a team effort. You can take someone with you though, if that's appropriate, and it might be that your organisation chooses to fund someone to travel with you. And a good example that I've referred to in other sessions is in 2017, Churchill Fellow was undertaking his fellowship looking at Indigenous cultural burning techniques to manage forests. And his employer did pay for an Indigenous staff member to accompany him on that fellowship. And he says both of them continue to work together, and they both agree it was all the better for that. So there are some ways you can consider supporting a fellowship with another person. If you're undertaking tertiary studies, that's okay. However, your project for your Churchill Fellowship can't form part of those studies. So you can't use a Churchill Fellowship to help you complete your master's or your PhD. That's not what it's for. The Churchill Fellowship is in itself a standalone project, and it does require a commitment and an ongoing commitment from you to continue to implement your findings. I need you to hear me say, though, as I said at the start of this slide, that a Churchill Fellowship is an opportunity for people from all walks of life. And that's, you know, something that gets thrown around quite a lot, but for us, it's an organizational mantra. We are really looking for a diverse range of people from all walks of life to apply for Churchill Fellowships. So please don't feel that it's not for you. There certainly are no limits in terms of the people that can apply, other than those that I mentioned on the slide. In terms of project eligibility, I think it's hopefully clear that your project must be suitable for a fellowship in the way that it will benefit the community by you bringing back and sharing your knowledge, your ideas, your practices, or your skills. You do need to demonstrate that you have fully explored your topic within Australia. I guess the best way that you can do that is to be able to confidently talk about what's happening in Australia and what's happening overseas that you might have noticed that's getting different results or potentially better results, whatever it might be. We don't want to pay for you to travel overseas when you could have learnt what you're going overseas to learn within Australia. I think that's obviously essential. The project you propose must be self-contained. As I mentioned, it can't be part of a university project that you're doing, but it also can't be partly funded by another organisation. I think it's important to keep in mind, you know, Churchill Fellowship, as I said before, it's much more than just an overseas trip. It's an amazing international exchange experience, but there's more to it than that when you come back. So we're not the external sort of travel budget department for whatever project you might currently be working on anyway. It doesn't need to relate to your employment. People often ask that. Obviously, it often does. People work in fields that they're passionate about, or they become passionate while working in a particular area. And that's fine. But you may have something that you're equally passionate about that's not related to your day-to-day work, and you can still apply for a fellowship if it's not directly related to your work. We do expect that you're involved in your topic area enough that you can demonstrate you have networks through which you'll share your findings on your return. We don't set limits on topics or issues, and that's really a strength. So you do design your own project, and that's the beauty of a Churchill Fellowship. If you can think of a suitable topic, there really aren't any limits. It's up to you, though, to convince a selection panel that your topic is important and that there are benefits to the Australian community in you pursuing it. We do offer some sponsored Churchill Fellowships where they may have come through a bequest, or generous individuals or organisations have agreed to fund fellowships on specific topics, or fellowships for people from particular geographic or other demographic segments. Now, this doesn't mean that they're always awarded. Sometimes they're on quite niche topics, and it doesn't mean that you need to select a sponsored fellowship. When you fill out your application form, you will have the option of choosing one or two sponsored fellowships where you think your project aligns with those topics. That won't disadvantage you for being selected for a normal Churchill Fellowship, and we will obviously look through applicants that are being recommended and award them a sponsored fellowship where it's strongly aligned. So it just helps us bring you, or it helps you bring to our attention where your project might align with a sponsored fellowship. When you think about framing your project, ask yourself, how will it benefit some aspect of Australian society? So hopefully you know that applications close at 5 p.m. on the 28th of April. There's still plenty of time to start your application if you haven't already. I, in fact, would recommend that you, as soon as you can, go to our website, click on the application button and start your application, because you'll be able to read through the form, you'll get an understanding of the kinds of questions that are being asked, and you can begin work framing your application. You can only use the online system, but if that's a barrier to you for a disability or other reasons, please contact us. We don't want anyone to be turned away because they couldn't fill out a form. Remember, you are competing against all other applicants. So think about how you're going to convince selectors to invest in you and your project idea. And to that end, you will need 2 referees. So again, think about who they're going to be, contact them as soon as you can, make sure they'll be available to undertake the reference for you, which they will do online through the system. You'll need someone who can vouch for you in terms of your personal characteristics, and someone who is an authority or has some credibility in relation to the topic of your project. Churchill Fellows told us time again that the process of working through the application and completing the form really helps them to fine-tune their project. So again, I'll keep repeating this: get in early, start your application, give yourself the best chance for your best application. If you leave it to the last minute, it's not going to be your best application. Now, when you create your application, you can save it and come back to it multiple times right up until the closing date. So, and you will be asked when you put your application in for your itinerary. So as you know, it's between 4 and 8 weeks of travel. We will be asking you to identify which countries you want to go to, which cities you want to go to, which organizations or people you'd like to meet with, and what you might be doing. So undertaking a course, observing particular things, meeting with them to interview them, whatever your approach is, you need to outline that, and for how many days you'll be in those different destinations, and that will help paint a picture of what your project's going to look like. Now, most of you are probably thinking, do I need to have organised with those people or organisations that they'll meet with me? And the answer is no, not for your application. I think you need to be aware that they will meet with people, or they're likely to meet with people, but you don't need to have made contact at that point. You need to really have a clear idea of who you might want to meet with and what you think you'll get out of those meetings. You do need to be quite specific. We will use that information, if you're recommended for a fellowship, to obviously budget for your fellowship. And so there can be some flexibility once you've been awarded. Sometimes things change and you need to refine your itinerary, but we can't make wholesale changes to your itinerary. So if you put an application in for a 4-week project that takes you to New Zealand, and you want to change it to an 8-week project that takes you to the UK, the US, and Europe, we're not going to be able to make those changes once you've been awarded. So I talked a bit about COVID at the start. Look, I think it's at a point now where travel is happening again. We've got insurance covered. So if you're awarded a Churchill Fellowship, that includes the travel costs, includes insurance, includes living expenses for food and accommodation, which you book yourself. And so that's fully funded and fully costed out for you. So you don't need to try and estimate those costs in your application at all. We do all of that. You just need to think about where you want to go, how long you want to go there for, and who you want to meet with. So in terms of the selection process, we have in each state and territory, we do have panels of selectors from a range of different fields and interest areas. I think an important thing to keep in mind is that there may not be someone on that selection panel who deeply understands your topic, particularly if you've got a kind of niche area you're in. So my advice here is don't use jargon, use plain English. Otherwise, it might be difficult for the selectors to really understand what you're on about. The best tip I can give you is to read and address the selection criteria. That's really important. Be clear and succinct. So on our website, you'll see there is a timeline where it shows the selection process and the various dates in each state and territory when interviews will be held. So the process will be, in most states, applications will be reviewed and a shortlist formed, and then people will be invited to interview. Following those interviews, you'll be recommended to our board and a final decision made in September. In New South Wales and Victoria, because of the size of those states and the number of applications, there will be a second interview. So you'll be shortlisted for a first interview, then another shortlist is formed and people will be invited to a second interview. If you do make it to an interview, look, it's a pretty big achievement. It's a competitive process. We normally get well in excess of 1,000 applications. And as I said, we normally award around 100 or so. So like, I think that's not bad odds, but it is competitive. So if you get to the interview stage, that's great. You can apply again. So please don't be put off if you don't get through. If you've applied previously and haven't got through, you're not alone. Many Churchill Fellows are awarded on the second, perhaps third application. And of course, a lot of people also get it on their first. So some things to remember, I've said it, it's very competitive. Churchill Fellowships are prestigious, they open doors overseas, they're highly funded, highly contested. That's not a reason to be shy. If you're here, you're thinking about it, that's great. That's a reason to put the most effort you can into your application. You'll be competing against everyone else who lodges an application, and most people who put an application in, tick the criteria pretty well. So you need to think about how you make your application stand out. Really, be clear. If there's a burning platform, this issue needs to be solved, it needs to be solved soon. Make that really clear in your application. So as I said, you can call our office, you can contact us through our website, by email. If you have any questions that you don't put up in the chat today, feel free to be in touch. And on that note, I'm going to now hand over to our first speaker, Dr. Katherine Butler-Bowden, who's Executive Director of Public Spaces in the Place Design and Public Spaces team at New South Wales Department of Planning, Industry and Environment, where she leads a team of strategists, policymakers, placemakers, landscape architects, project managers, planners and storytellers to improve and shine a spotlight on the value of public space in New South Wales. On that note, I'm going to hand over to Katherine.
Thanks so much, Adam. And hi, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen. Nearly there. Oh. I'm just going to go back to the beginning. Sorry, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? Hello.
I can hear you just fine. And
awesome. Okay.
Don't have the microphone.
Thanks so much, Adam. It was really great to listen, actually. I remember way back when, in 2017, going to one of these panels myself to listen. And I suppose that's why I've called it 3 times lucky. And how do you make your application compelling? I had indeed gone for the Churchill Fellowship twice before I was successful on the 3rd time. And I think the difference was actually coming to one of these sessions and listening to both the person running the trust at the time and then those people who'd been successful. So I'm just going to talk you through briefly what I did, but really focus on the application process and the kind of impact that you can do. You can find me on LinkedIn and Instagram though, if there's specific things that you want to ask following. So Adam's dead right about you need to make it compelling. And I think back to when I applied and, sort of 5 years on, thinking about, perhaps what was, did I know that, what the world has experienced since that time, and would I have changed the application? But think beyond your immediate year that you're in to what really can make the greatest impact in terms of the topic that you select. So this is my project. Yes, it was about public spaces. Interestingly, I was working in cultural institutions at the time, and in a way the Churchill was a stepping stone to a career on perhaps a bigger at bigger scale across the city, and sort of adding more place, I suppose, to the work that I was doing. So it was about new global models of visitor accessibility and experience across really 5 countries, because it included England and Scotland. So when I came back, I did a pretty thorough report, because what I really found with this project was that it was 10 years of kind of thinking in my current role and beyond. So that was just the snapshot of where I went. What was the most benefit, I think, in it, with the 25 in-depth interviews I did with global leaders. I underestimated the impact of just talking to people and having that 90 minutes or whatever it was, as well as actually experiencing those sites. So it was a pretty busy 5 weeks. I had still got 2 children, 2 children, younger children at the time. So you can see that was my daughter plotting when to ring me, so that she didn't wake me up in the night. I've always quite liked the fact that she called it Churchill. Anyway, she's grown up a bit since then. So that my aims, I'm not going to go through them in detail because the report is on the website, but it was really that thing that Adam's talked about. What can you not do in Australia? Why do you need to travel? How do you make that compelling, that case? So obviously I've done a lot of desk research and so forth, but if you really want to have that experience, you've got to be there. So the other aim that I wanted to call out was that I wanted to identify factors of success. So what was sort of universal to these sites in some ways, in terms of improvements that have been made so that these sites were attractive to 21st century audiences. And it was also about, how do I meet leaders in this industry? I think sometimes from Australia, we don't always get to participate necessarily in what's happening in Europe and the States and Asia and so forth, perhaps as much as we could do. And the Churchill was the stepping stone to doing that. So I took 1 million pictures and videos and so forth. I tried to sort of make the choices that I made as to where I was going as broad as possible, from very ancient sites right through to very contemporary sites, to see that kind of full range. But as you can see, I was trying to pick places that were really adapting to, as I said, 21st century audiences, perhaps from the cafe experience, as you can see there, Louisiana, through to the exhibition experience, through exhibitions and so forth, and where they had really introduced interactivity. There were serious highlights. I think going to Falling Water, that was my own picture of that site. It looks a bit postcardy, doesn't it? But that is the viewing point back. And I think this was quite a hard to get to site, and I ummed and ahed as to whether or not I really needed to go there, but sometimes they're the absolute jewels in the itinerary. So make sure you build the itinerary when you apply around those places that you really want to go to, and then obviously build in enough time. This was outside Pittsburgh. You know, I had to talk a New York friend into coming because I was too scared to drive in the States, and he flew with me and then drove, because it, as I say, I mean, you can see it's quite hard to get to, but it was one of those absolute extraordinary experiences, including the whole weekend where it's deep Trump territory. You know, we had kind of very unusual experiences, staying overnight and so forth. Meeting people, that was one of the absolute highlights. This is the woman who won Stonehenge. And, you know, we talked a lot about simple things like where buses get parked and so forth. What's the accessibility? How do they get people in and out and purchasing in the shop and all sorts of things, so that then that money gets fed back in? This is, I'm just going to let you watch that one sec.
For you are, and this is no secret, my one true heir and the future king of Denmark.
Now, as for your plans to return to Wittenberg to continue your studies, it goes against our plans for your future.
Yes, you are to remain here by your mother's side to cheer and comfort her.
So that one was, that wasn't even on my list. That's Kronborg Castle. It's the place of Hamlet. It's UNESCO World Heritage Site. And I really, it was pretty extraordinary. I'd only kind of planned to do an hour there, but I spent the day there and reshuffled what I was doing. And I think what was key to that was that they had really brought that site to life through a whole range of different sorts of programming. So make sure you build in enough time within that itinerary to take in those kind of jewels or those gems along the way. So application, I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this, and I've only got about 6 minutes left. Impact, impact, impact. How do you demonstrate through that written application? Because the first step is the written application. So you've got that one chance plus the referees to really sell your project, and then of course if you get to interview, that's another thing. So you really have to tell the story of how you're going to create impact. The Churchill, what I loved about the Churchill Trust is that, yes, it's about what you're studying or kind of investigating, but it's really about what you bring back to Australia, and that's the inspire locally bit. So really think about that. That's not just some sort of afterthought. That needs to be intrinsic to your application. You need clarity and you need context. As Adam said, often the people, you're probably the most knowledgeable about that topic. So how do you sell it in plain language, and how do you really convey that you're not talking in jargon and so forth? Because the people on the panel might not necessarily know the detail of your topic. How do you get urgency? I work now in central government, and urgent and unavoidable are the two terms to get things funded. So how do you bring urgency? Why this topic, and why now, and why you? If you can nail those three things, I think that's essential. And I believe that's why I missed out in the first 2 times I applied, because I just couldn't really convey that. How do you connect to an audience is obviously very important. Plain language, no jargon, write it simply, say what you mean. How can your topic really potentially have Australian significance? So I'd worked in New South Wales, for years and years, but how could I kind of move it beyond my kind of patch in terms of the work I'd led to something bigger? Planning the itinerary is really important. This isn't a shopping list of countries or cities that you've always wanted to go to. You really need to craft it. Why these places, and how you're going to research when you're there. I sort of did 5 takeaways at the end of every night when I would come back to the hotel. That were then the kind of the shape of the case studies and success factors and the rest of it. So make sure you're gearing your agenda or your itinerary to what you want to do, because obviously when you get to interview, you are asked about that. Choosing referees carefully, I can't underscore that enough. Choose 2 people who know your work really well. The personal reference can talk about you, the difference that you can make, and so forth. And the professional and the project one, somebody's got deep knowledge as to why you need to travel overseas and what you will bring back. So think about that construction of the fellowship, if you like. Think about it as a construction. Think about those research methods, the core questions you would ask, the types of reading, the site visits, the interviews, so forth. And I crafted mine around different sites that was then really useful when I came home. I'm a big social media person. I use it a lot in the work that I do. And from the get-go of getting the fellowship, I kind of announced it. I had a hashtag and I told that story throughout. And what I felt was that I sort of carried the people with me too, who I was meeting. So make sure you're thinking about that. How can you use digital media and other sorts of things to tell that story whilst you're on the fellowship, and then of course when you're home? So before I got home, I did a LinkedIn post. I'd never really used LinkedIn that much, but I said, please let me know if you would like me to come and share the ideas and lessons I took away. And I just got all these messages from people. And then, I gave about 30 or so talks in various parts of Australia. So meeting people was so important. choose some sites or some places where you do much deeper investigational research. This was one I learnt so much from National Trust for Scotland, spending, you know, a couple of days at their sites and with them. Pick places that are really leading edge in terms of what they're doing, so that you can kind of tell that story. And then it's just those takeaways that some of those interviews stay with me forever. And this was one of them. She had run the Heritage Lottery Fund, and you can read that quote, but it was really meaningful, and she just distilled it so simply. Of course, accessibility is not about disabilities, it's about life, it's critical and so forth. It's about caring for mum and dad, it's about getting a buggy in and out, through to people with hearing impairments. And so there were some interviews that really kind of hit home in the most beautiful way. Yeah, craft around the places and the cities, and also the international leaders that you really want to work with. And so when I came home, I was sort of thinking all the time about how I could tell the story, and I distilled it into these 6 success factors, and wrote a report which is kind of basically 6 mini chapters, and then the series of case studies, and then the findings. And so if you kind of can think forward in time to you being home and what you're going to do and how you're going to tell that story. And I think if I'd known that, that would have helped me with the application in many ways to help frame it. So you know, look at all the reports that people have. The Churchill have got all the reports online, and sometimes that can be really helpful to how you're framing it. And then that's one of the really special places I went to was Blenheim, of course, where Churchill was born and where he got engaged. And so I tried to find these little ways of connecting in across. And then that was the morning I came home at Sydney Airport to a very happy family. My husband had coped just fine. My daughter had very bad lice and a couple of other things, but other than that, it was all smooth sailing, and I'm incredibly grateful to them for supporting me. The one thing I'll say is that really, I cannot underestimate how this fellowship really transformed, you know, my life in many ways. Certainly my professional life. It was a once in a lifetime opportunity. Give it all you can. It's so worth it, but demonstrate that benefit, because it's great that you might be successful in getting it, but it's the value of it is when you come home and share that story, and how it can kind of have that echo effect or the halo effect of the luck. Because if you make it, you know, it's an incredible honour. So yeah, I think that's probably it from me. I think that's my last slide. So I'm going to stop sharing and hand to back to you, Adam. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Carolyn. That's fantastic. I always learned something new. I hadn't heard of someone a lice infestation on a fellowship before. So there you go.
Oh yeah, sorry, I overshared.
But that's a great segue into Katherine Webber's Churchill Fellowship, where she undertook a fellowship to increase the accessibility to public toilets by researching taboos, design policy, and legal barriers. And Katherine is passionate about social justice and inclusion. And she's a social planning practitioner with over 12 years experience working for a range of government and non-government organisations across Australia and the Pacific. She has considerable experience in developing and implementing community plans, programs and policy to improve social inclusion and participation. So on that note, I'm going to hand over now to Katherine Webber.
Thank you very much, Adam. And let me just start sharing my screen as well. Presentation. So I'm joining you today from Meanjin, the land of the Yagara and Turrbal people, here in Brisbane. And a lot of what I was going to say has Caroline has touched on as well. So my Churchill Fellowship is an example that any topic can be covered. I enjoy talking about public toilets. I think they're essential for access and inclusion in our public spaces, and they're a topic that just aren't talked about enough. And so This is some of the different places that I went to. I was away for the full 8 weeks, and my itinerary did change. I was planning on heading towards the end of the year, but there was an opportunity because the Commission of the Status of the Women, which is a UN conference that's run every year, had the theme of infrastructure and service delivery. And I'm like, that is super important to public toilets. I need to get our itinerary around. So I ended up traveling in the lot colder months than what I was originally planning. So I think I did over 38 interviews in that 8-week period, and mostly traveled to the US, the UK and Europe. And I met with a variety of different people. So I was meeting with community advocates, I was meeting with academics, policymakers, and went to this beautiful place here. Was the first pump station in the UK, so looking at how sewage was treated. So yeah, travelled across the globe and just had wonderful conversations about public toilets with anybody who would talk with me. So one of the highlights was definitely going to the Commission of the Status of Women and meeting people from around the world. So I really got to meet lots of people that I wouldn't have got to visit along the way because they were all in the same place. I also got to meet toilet manufacturers, and so got to talk from both sides, from the user perspective as well as the design and the manufacturers as well. For me, I didn't see that there were many people talking about public toilets in Australia. And I thought it was super important. It didn't necessarily link directly with my job. So mine was an example of it's aligned, but it's a little bit outside of the work that I'm doing. And this was probably the example of the ugliest public toilet that I did visit. You can see that the doors have been cut off halfway. Probably for a public safety reason, but does not make these attractive public toilets to use. So my itinerary, I had 1 or 2 people I wanted to meet in each city, but the benefits was that people would give you lots of referrals. Oh, have you spoken to this person? I arrived in Portland, slightly jet lagged. They had organised a community meeting for me and then an entire week of activities. So I thought I was meeting 1 or 2 people, but I had the entire week planned out for me. So that was really wonderful. And similarly, photographs tell 1,000 words. So I took thousands of photographs of public toilets, and I continue to do that as well. When you are applying for your application, definitely seek out the support for your colleagues. Talk to people about what they know, they don't know, what they want to know, or who are people you could talk to. I did a lot of research on Twitter and social media to see who was talking about public toilets, and that was how I planned my itinerary. Also, when you're writing your application, you need to get over the imposter syndrome. One of the best things about being a Churchill Fellow is being called an expert, but it is also extremely daunting. Every time they're like, Katherine knows a lot about public toilets, and I do, but you still need to overcome that thought of like, oh, really, am I the right person to be talking about it? If it's something you're passionate about and you think you can bring a unique angle to the conversation, I definitely encourage you applying. So these are photos of the Portland Loo. The community got together and designed what they wanted to see in a public toilet, and it's then designed by manufactured locally in Portland. They now ship these around the world. So I got to meet the people who were involved in the community planning and the manufacturers, as well as the policymakers. So this is one example there. From a time commitment, it was obviously the time traveling. It took quite a bit of preparation once you've been accepted. It's finalizing all the meetings, it's booking the accommodation. And then when I came back, similarly to Caroline, I really wanted an impactful report. So really spent some time working out what those case studies were, what were the key themes that I came across, and spent some time writing it up as well. This is a picture of the Uri lift. So during the day, it is hidden underground, and at night time, it pops up as a urinal can only be used by some sections of the population, though. So this is me at my presentation. So I'm middle photograph. This is when I learnt, this is the Auslan flea, brings a lot of joy, but it's also a really important topic. Since the Churchill Fellowship, I have spoken to numerous people about it. I also got to participate in the Policy Impact Program. And we travelled to Canberra and presented all of our reports. You can see that pretty picture here of us all. And since then, I've received a lot of media coverage. So you also want it to be a topic that you want your name associated with. I've had to show my grandparents this picture of males' urinals next to my name. So, you know, something to consider about when you're choosing your topic as well. And it definitely has been a lifelong journey. And there's so many more opportunities that I'm exploring around public toilets. I try to incorporate it into my work, but it also sits outside my paid employment. So it is also a passion topic. So happy to answer any questions, and I'll stop there.
Great, thank you, Katherine. That was fantastic. So we do have only a couple of questions, but what I do find is questions start to arrive once we start answering them. So Katie and Nicole just asked for a bit more information, or for me to elaborate about when and for whom domestic travel is appropriate. So as I said, I guess at the outset, Churchill Fellowship is for international travel. We have introduced this year the opportunity for people who live in remote parts of Australia, remote communities, who otherwise have not had the opportunity to travel within Australia, and for whom international travel would pose too big a barrier, and where there's still opportunities for their communities to benefit from them learning domestically and returning to share that knowledge. So I think that hopefully paints a reasonable picture there for you. That said, what isn't new is if you live in Norfolk Island, you certainly have been able to undertake travel to Australia for a long time, and that has not changed as part of your fellowship. Another question is, if we have applied for other grants, this is not a grant, I may repeat, how does this interface with Churchill Fellowships? So I guess I would say hopefully they don't interface at the same time, because you're going to be expected to give 100% to your Churchill Fellowship if you receive one. And I think you heard from Caroline and Katherine that it's a pretty big undertaking. So planning for it, traveling overseas, coming back, synthesizing what you've learned, and then implementing it. It doesn't end there. So it's quite a big task. And you know, it's possible that the intersection might be on your return, you apply for grants to help you implement those findings and continue to make impact. And that way, you'll see on my virtual background, impact funding. This is something new that we're offering, Churchill Fellows. There are many other things we offer, a few strings to the Churchill Fellowship bow nowadays. But this new one is funding that fellows can apply for to assist them implement an aspect of their fellowship findings or recommendations. So that's where perhaps other grants or perhaps the impact funding we offer might intersect there. So I hope that's helpful. And Nicole asked what are our thoughts on virtual travel. Well, our thoughts are we're very open to it. COVID, you know, really presented an opportunity for people who couldn't travel internationally because you couldn't, but had a need to get on with their projects to do their fellowships virtually. And the people that chose to do that did a very fine job. Clearly, there are some projects that just aren't suited to doing over a video conferencing, and that's fine. And it's not always going to be the same experience as being there face to face, and you know, understanding the culture of the country you're in, etc. That said, we are now offering virtual travel. As I mentioned, if you are physically unable to travel, and it may be that you have a disability that just makes that really difficult, you might have caring responsibilities that just make it really difficult for you to travel overseas for 4 to 8 weeks. And in those cases, we're absolutely open to virtual travel. We've proven that it works, and we're open to that as well. We do have around 200 Churchill Fellowship recipients who haven't been able to travel during the COVID pandemic, and we're seeing a few people now undertaking, I guess, what we're calling a hybrid approach, where they might do a shorter, they might have been planning to do a 6-week fellowship, they might do 4 weeks overseas, and then they'll pick up 2 weeks doing virtual interviews, just to kind of limit their travel while there's still a bit of uncertainty, and make that happen. So that's our thoughts on virtual travel. Another question, can you please elaborate on who will be the best placed as a professional referee, and what you might recommend if you don't know someone well or personally in the field you want to study? So I wonder if Carolyn or Katherine, you might be able to talk through how you chose your project referee.
Yeah, I'm happy to. So public toilets, it's a lot of the work is done sector by sector. There's that lack of overarching public toilet planning and policy, which is my niche. So what I found was I approached people who I'd been having some conversations with, and they helped identify, and they wrote a referee that was saying the importance of doing this research. Yeah. And so they were people known to me. But since then, I cold called people and said, hey, I really love what you're doing. And so I think there's a way of either working through people that you do know that can see the value of your research, or approaching people to say, hey, I think I'm the best person to do this. Would you be willing to support my application?
Yeah, I mean, I'd echo that, Katherine. I think the key is to pick people who can kind of look at it with some perspective, both where you sit professionally within your area, within your sort of field, I suppose. And then my sense is the project. I think there's still the 2 referees, isn't there, Adam? There's the personal and the project.
Yep.
The personal, I think it's really useful to have somebody who understands what you've been able to achieve so far, and why this would be the kind of the difference that this fellowship could make when you return. So somebody with kind of that broad span. Whereas the project, it would be good to get somebody, I think, as Katherine said, who's got as much knowledge of that particular topic as to why you need to travel internationally to do this, I think, and that's that significance bit. So somebody who understands the Australian context, or the New South Wales context, or wherever you're coming to today, the South Australian context, whatever that looks like.
And I'll just add one more trick in there is feel free to help them draft it. Everyone likes a good draft.
Yeah. Or just some dot points or something like that to them. I agree. Because a lot of referees are very time poor. Whatever you do, don't send it to them with 48 hours to go. Make sure you've had a conversation with those 2 people, that that you're preparing them, so you give it the best shot that you possibly can, because they are important, aren't they, Adam?
Absolutely. Look, it's really good advice, and the number one phone call we receive of many on the closing date for applications is, oh my goodness, my referees have not submitted. That's because you didn't speak to them early enough and you haven't been in touch with them. So absolutely good advice from Carolyn and Katherine there. I'll keep moving through the questions. Katie asked about the selection panels or committees. Does each panel have a First Nations representative? I'm going to say no. Do I want each panel to have one? Yes. We are not quite there yet, and we've had some committee changes that have resulted in me saying no this year. I don't think we will on every panel, but it's certainly something that we are working towards. We definitely have First Nations representatives involved on our board, and patron, Tom Karma, has been fantastic at helping us identify other people that we can put on selection panels, as our Indigenous Churchill Fellows network is. So we don't have it on every panel, is my answer, but we certainly want to. If my current job is not aligned with the project that I'm passionate about, how the work experience question listed in the application form will justify that? Should I list all experience from the field there together with paid work? Look, I think probably yes. If your project isn't aligned with your job, as I said, that doesn't have to be the case. I think it's useful to list your current work if you are employed. Some people apply and then don't have an employer, which is also fine. But I think listing the experience there, I'd say start an application, have a look through, because we do ask you, one of the questions is to talk about your experience in relation to the project that you're proposing. So you'll have an opportunity to talk about that in the application. And then if you do get an interview, you'll certainly be given the opportunity to expand on that further. Flexibility around the starting date of 1 Feb. So how it works is that if you're successful this year, you can depart from 1 February and you have 12 months. So you need to have departed Australia by the end of January 2024. So you'll have a 12-month window from 1 Feb next year, during which you can undertake your fellowship. And can the fellowship cover the first 8 weeks of a 12-week trip? It's kind of a tricky question, and I can take that in a few different ways. So I will. If you want to, if we award you a fellowship and it's 8 weeks, and you say, look, I'd like to take a 4-week holiday through Europe at my own expense, yeah, sure. Look, you can do that. We don't mind. It's a great opportunity to do that if you want to. If you're talking about, well, my project's really a 12-week project and I've got funding from this other organisation to help me do it, I just need you to pay for the first 8 weeks, the answer is going to be probably no. That's probably not going to work, and you probably won't get selected if that's how you're framing your project. So I think hopefully those two ways of interpreting your question are useful. How did the projects that Carolyn and Katherine undertook differ from or enlarge on what they have been finding out as part of their work roles? Well, I think, because I'm conscious of time, I highly recommend you read Carolyn and Katherine's reports, and I think it will become quite evident as to how going overseas and meeting with these other organisations and people were clearly things that they would not have learnt in their roles here in Australia. Do we have a target of distributing fellowships based on diversity, including cultural as well as gender? We don't have a specific target number, but absolutely, as I said earlier, we are looking actively for a diverse range of applicants from all walks of life, and that covers a whole range of different attributes and backgrounds of people for Churchill Fellowships. Age, we absolutely want to see a spread. I think I get asked, what's the oldest we've awarded Churchill Fellowship to? I think it was 70 years of old is the oldest person we've awarded a fellowship to. Youngest is actually 13, but that was quite a few years ago, and you have to be 18 now. So that's the lower end. But certainly we're definitely alive to diversity, and that's something we do look closely at, and we have undertaken and continue to undertake specific communication and marketing and outreach campaigns to attract people with cultural diversity and other attributes where we can see we're not getting. So we do collect information through the application process to help inform us with that as well. Do we have a quota of fellowships for each state and territory? Yes and no. So we start off with an allocation of, so say for example, we decide and the board agrees we'll award 105 fellowships or whatever the number might be this year. We'll use population data to award, I guess, to each state and territory a sort of startup number of fellowships that they can award. As I mentioned earlier, there are sponsored fellowships, we call them, where they could be awarded maybe to a specific state, so that would add to their allocation, or they could be nationally available. And once all the interviews are finished and recommendations are made, we'll allocate fellowships to those sponsor fellowships, and that will then change the number for those states and territories. So typically we see the smaller states like ACT or territories like ACT or Northern Territory or Tasmania, they would get no less than 4 under our kind of rules, but they would almost always punch above their weight because they'll get some sponsor fellowships that fall their way. So it kind of goes as per the population, but then it varies. And one more question here is how to address the fact that there may be relevant examples within Australia for your topic, but they may not be successful, or the international examples are demonstrating best practice. So that's probably really going to be your challenge. And you know, the purpose behind your application is to explain to us, to selectors, that this particular issue that you're interested in, there are people in Australia, you're not the only one doing it, there are other people doing it, but they're not really achieving the kind of results that you think could be achieved in Australia. And you've identified these people or these places overseas that are doing things differently. They're getting different results. Perhaps you can already quantify they're getting better results depending on what the topic is, and that, you know, there's the need to go over there and come back and share that knowledge so that other people in Australia can also start doing things differently, and you can influence how that's done. So I think that's really going to be your job. We don't expect that you're going to be the only person in Australia working on your issue. You know, invariably, when awarding over 100 fellowships a year, we'll find there'll be people from different states and territories who have similar topics. I've yet to see ones that are exactly the same, and we have the opportunity to connect people up there where they can collaborate a bit as well. So yeah, I hope that answers that question. And on that note, I would love to thank Carolyn and Katherine again for your great work and for spending the time to share your experiences with our attendees. And thank you to all attendees. If you're applying for a fellowship this year, best luck to you, and please don't be shy, get your application started. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.